Brilliant. So welcome everybody to our first mental health conference for sport and physical activity. My name is Alicia Pollack. I'm a health project officer at Heart Sports Partnership. This conference is being delivered as part of the East of England Mind Regional Network Hub. Just a little bit about housekeeping for today's session. If you could please keep yourself muted at all times, unless Matt specifically requests you to unmute yourself. Also advised to keep your video off as the session is being recorded. And any questions for Matt, if you could please put them in the chat box and we'll review those and then ask Matt at the end of the session. There will be time for a Q&A. Also, just to let you know, this webinar may contain some sensitive content. So if you find any of it to be triggering or upsetting, then please feel free to take time out. And please do let us know how you're feeling if you feel you had to take some time off. And also support available if you would like to talk to somebody and find yourself in that situation, then over here you can see 3 different helplines that are available there for you. So I'm just going to pause for a second and let people take a photo or a screenshot. Okay, so just to kind of tell you a little bit more why we're doing the conference today. So as I mentioned before, this is our first mental health conference for the East of England region. It's been delivered as part of the Mind Regional Network Hub, which was funded by Sport England through Mind. The program aims to bring together sport, physical activity and mental health organizations in the Eastern region to share best practice and updates, increase collaboration and partnership working. We work very closely with the 5 active partnerships in our region. That's Active Essex, Living Sport, Team Beds and Luton, Active Suffolk and Active Norfolk. So if there's anything that you would like to bring up or get in touch, please feel free to do so. On the next slide, you can see my contact details. That's if you would like to contact me directly, anything to do with mental health, physical activity or the Mind Regional Hub. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I'm going to pass over to Matt, who's our evaluation expert for today.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be with you guys today. Thanks so much for coming along to this session, which I hope will be both informative and in some ways enjoyable for you. My name is Matt Hughes-Short. Thank you, Alicia, for the little introduction. Today's session, we're going to talk about qualitative evaluation in particular in relation to mental health projects. And the main focus is about trying to make qualitative evaluation accessible for yourselves within your work, and also some of the sensitivity considerations that we need to have when we're working with particular audiences and the client base that we might have for mental health related projects. So just to give you a really brief introduction to myself, as you say, my name is Matt. I've worked in public health at the local, county and national level. I've also worked in sports development and previously used to work for the Sports Partnership. Specialise in sports coaching for children and adults with disabilities and learning disabilities as well. In my spare time, I do some lecturing at a variety of universities on sports coaching and sport and exercise psychology. And I also do a lot of training and workshop facilitation, particularly around qualitative evaluation, behaviour change, and trying to put behaviour change into projects in a practical way. I currently can be found plying my trade in the Public Health England National Physical Activity Team. And they've given me the opportunity to come along today to chat to you guys a little bit about this. So as Alicia said, if you've got a question, do type it into the chat and obviously keep your mic on mute. And if you have a question, you can always turn your mic off mute at the end when we have a little bit of a chat. So just to go through the learning outcomes that I've set for today, hopefully we'll cover all of these. Firstly, you'll be able to hopefully walk away and describe the relevance of collecting qualitative data when evaluating a mental health project. You'll be able to recognise the suitable qualitative evaluation methods for use in those mental health settings. Hopefully you'll then be able to walk away and apply that knowledge into your project management in a very client-centred way, which is particularly focused around the sensitivity element. And then hopefully what that will allow you to do is be able to develop your own qualitative evaluation protocol draft, which you can then use within your own mental health projects. So let's get started on this little whirlwind tour. And see, to start us off, what I just want to do is I just want to give us a brief coverage of what qualitative evaluation is. Some of you will be very familiar with it. Some of you might not be. It's always difficult to know. So it's just to give you guys a little bit of a brief introduction to that. So what is it to start with? Well, what makes us very different from other animals on this planet is that we have the ability to assign meaning to things. We can look at something and we can immediately try to decide what that means to us. A really great example is that sometimes we will perceive things differently, whether or not it's behaviors, whether or not it's emotions, images, whatever that might be. Great example here, duck or rabbit in this particular picture, and I often bring this one into some of my presentations. And what qualitative research actually allows us to do is it lets us ask about and then record and actually try to interpret that meaning-making process, how we go about forming those perceptions. So the aim for us as project managers, as researchers, or just people who are interested in qualitative evaluation in general, is to try to understand the social reality of individuals, of groups, and of cultures, how that is perceived and what meaning is taken from that. So in terms of its sister, quantitative, they're often presented as representing two different worldviews, and that's a very accurate way of putting about it, because quantitative is often very much about measurement, how we can measure something, whether or not that's in numerical format or otherwise. And they can be used separately, or they can be used very effectively together, depending on the type of question that you're answering, that you're trying to answer for your research or for your project. And qualitative can sometimes be looked down upon by quantitative researchers in quite a superior way, mainly because the argument is that with quantitative research, you can create a lot of rigor to try to actually demonstrate that something definitely means something. So we know 1 and 1 equals 2, 3 and 3 equals 6. You can define that very clearly. And in fact, here's a quote that I took from a paper that was reviewing a piece of qualitative research. Even for a qualitative study, I would accept some form of t-test or confidence interval analysis utilized to analyze result significance. All very fancy statistical tests. And this is somebody looking at a qualitative study and essentially getting what we would describe as qualitative envy. So they want to try to sort of put a quantitative spin on it to try to help to understand it. But that's not what qualitative is all about. If you want to measure something, you would go with a quantitative approach. You would go for a Likert scale on a questionnaire or something like that. Qualitative is not about that. And our reasons for completing qualitative evaluation can really vary. It could be because we're trying to study how something works. It could be because we're trying to reveal some meaning in something, particularly if our project is focusing on a particular topic. It could be that we're looking to try to make comparisons as a way of identifying themes that can be then used to try to understand someone's perception of something. It could be that we're looking to capture someone's individual story and understand their experience in a particular context. It could be that we're trying to explain how a system functions and then the consequences of that system, whether or not it's public health or some kind of local sports system. It could be that we're trying to identify unintended consequences. So you've delivered a project, but things have happened that you weren't expecting. We want to try and understand what those unintended consequences are. And as I've mentioned already, it could be that you're just trying to understand the context of something. You know, it could be that you want to understand why this works at this time rather than at that time. All about that contextual information. So there's a variety of reasons that we can look at exploring qualitative evaluation and research, and how that data looks can really vary. So a qualitative report, when you're drafting it up, will describe and interpret something, regardless of what it is that you're looking into. And the data and how that looks will come in a few forms. It could be words, stories, observations, and documents. And in fact, we can classify that data into 3 different forms. We can have in-depth open-ended interviews. We could have direct observations or some kind of observation, Or we could have written communications in the form of a journal or a log or some kind of opportunity to write things down, whether that's social media posts or things like that. So the data will look very different to how we would immediately consider data to look when it comes to statistics or quantitative research or evaluation. And in terms of when we compare the two and we think about those differences, it's a really useful little chance to see the difference. So we know that quantitative is based on numbers. It's often got a much larger sample size, sometimes for big projects in the hundreds or thousands. We know that there's going to be statistical analysis involved to try and work it out and how it works. We know that it's going to be very objective and that it will always form the same conclusion each time. We know that the questions around it are very closed and focused on plus, or rather than opening things up and trying to explore a little bit in more detail. And we know that it's actually often trying to validate a hypothesis, that idea that you've got that A is going to equal B or something like that. In terms of the qualitative, we know it's going to be based on opinions and experiences, that it's going to have a smaller sample size often, particularly for sort of niche projects. It's going to have those interviews and observations and that written format. It's going to be more subjective. We can't necessarily reach conclusions straight away. And we also know that it's going to be focused on open-ended questions and trying to generate a hypothesis or develop some ideas. So some of the different forms that data could take would be direct quotes. It could be the open-ended responses in the questionnaires that you send out at the end of a study or a project. It could be those social media posts. It could be some detailed description of a specific activity or behavior. It could be passages from records, from journals or from old logbooks, or it could be memoranda or correspondence. So the way in which those different types of data provide you with information will be extremely varied, and each one could offer you something different. And in fact, when we're trying to do qualitative research or qualitative evaluation, we'd often be looking to try to get a variety of those different examples so that we can really strengthen our conclusion that we come to at the end. So that's a really, really brief summary of what qualitative is. So the things that we can think about moving forward from here are: A, qualitative research involves studying things in their natural settings and attempting to make sense of them or interpret them. B, the research is often exploratory and is seeking more to explain how and why a particular phenomenon or behavior or emotion operates as it does in a particular context. And the methods could be very varied in terms of having in-depth open interviews, direct observations, or written communications. And that is a really, really brief summary of what qualitative is, because the topic of qualitative research and evaluation is extremely complex. And actually, we could talk about it for hours here today, really going into a lot of detail about it. But this is just to try to set us up to think about how qualitative evaluation can be simplified and used within those mental health settings, and trying to think about what is suitable for our projects. There's actually quite a rich history of qualitative research and evaluation relating to mental health. And it previously had a really heavy emphasis on ethnography, particularly in very extreme environments. So ethnography is a type of qualitative research that's focused on living within a culture to try to understand it. So you will become part of that culture and you'll draw conclusions from being within it. So to give you a couple of examples of old school papers that looked at that, there was one in 1981 by Estroff that looked at very specifically being with psychiatric clients within an American community setting. And another really good example is one by Rhodes in 1991 about being within an emergency psychiatric unit and working with psychiatric patients. But again, often the issue that comes up with not only qualitative in mental health settings, but in other settings as well, is that it carries that unscientific tag. And actually, a reason for this, Palinkas did a paper in 2014 where he specified that actually he thinks that this is largely because people don't understand the methods. They don't have any experience with the methods. And as a consequence, it looks unscientific from the outside. But there are ways of adding rigor to a qualitative evaluation or qualitative research that makes it far more useful within the mental health setting. And now those methods are starting to be used far more prominently across mental health projects and research. And in fact, in terms of project management more broadly, qualitative evaluation is incredibly valuable. And it's starting to get much more exposure as a way of trying to understand what an audience needs and actually how we can adapt our services or adapt something to do with our audience to try and make it more worthwhile, to have more impact, and actually to get the outcomes that we're looking for. So in terms of qualitative as an approach for project management, it's ideal for supporting the development of a pilot. So if you're looking to work with a particular audience and you've not worked with them before, it's excellent as a way of trying to get in amongst them to try and find out what they would want and how they would want it. And in fact, that audience that we just mentioned there, they are pivotal, as we all know from project management, to actually getting a successful project, because you want them to be there, you want them to interact, and you want them to get something from it. It's also extremely useful for finalizing concepts and trying to actually understand whether or not a concept is valid and whether or not it could actually work in a setting. You might have a fantastic idea about trying to improve, say, the mental health literacy of young children in, say, a local level in your area. To find out how that's going to work effectively, what would you need to do? Well, it could be having conversations with the parents. It could be having suitable conversations with the children. It could be having suitable conversations with people who will actually get you into that environment. And that is what the qualitative side of things can do for you. It can really help to finalize those concepts and develop a project. And when you think about what it offers for you and what it offers our participants as well, incorporating those perceptions actually is a really necessary component for not only creating an intervention, but also being able to refine it and improve it moving forward. So in terms of what it allows the client or the participant who's going to come along and take part, it could present them with the opportunity to raise some concerns about your project. It could give them the opportunity to voice their opinions. And actually, it also could make sure that they are appropriately represented in terms of whether or not that's diversity or whether or not they feel like there's more groups that could be a part of it that could help to improve it. Now, what it will provide you with is very, very rich transparency between you and your participants. A really good opportunity for them to understand what it is that you're actually looking to achieve. And also it gives you the chance to form a better relationship and a really well-established rapport with your client base. Because in terms of what they want and what they need, they are the expert because they are living their own experience. And it also allows you to enhance the quality of your planning to inform the development, particularly in terms of making sure you understand how well that intervention could potentially work within that environment. Now, all this is very well, but we have to really be thinking about what the right design is. And qualitative design comes in a variety of different settings and a variety of different types. Some of them are very complex. And in fact, when you're first looking at qualitative design, you look at it and you think, whoa, you know, there's so much here, you know, this looks like it's good for that, that looks like it's good for this. Each one of these potentially has their own place. But in terms of simplifying this for, say, local level project management, particularly if you are a project manager looking to try to get out something that you can use to actually create or develop a project, you can break these down a little bit further. Phenomenology is a very in-depth style of interviewing, very much focused on one particular phenomenon. And we can actually look to potentially eliminate that from here because the complexity around that is quite significant. Grounded theory is often used when you're actually trying to develop some kind of model moving forward or refine a theory that can then be used and move forward within the academic field. And again, it's something that we can potentially eliminate from the equation here. Ethnography, this could be suitable if you're potentially working with a university, you know, or if you've got somebody who's actually looking to do this as a research project, who's willing to go and live and work within a particular culture for a period of time to understand it a little bit better. But for us, it's probably not necessarily suitable for this setting. So that leaves us with two options: case studies, which everyone will have a broad understanding of potentially, as we often use them for monitoring, whether or not that's to local public health or whether or not it's to Sport England or the big lottery. And then we've also got a more general style of qualitative inquiry as well. So let's think about case studies first. So what are they? Well, they're versatile, that's for sure. You know, they allow you to be descriptive, they allow you to be explanatory, and they allow you to be exploratory. or you can be one of each or all together. And the way that they work is that a single case study will explore a participant experience in a single setting or group and very much focus on that one participant. In terms of multiple case studies, actually what that allows you to do is compare those experiences across different settings. So for example, it could be you might be looking at a case study around one particular project, not necessarily diving very deep into each individual, but more just about how that project worked, how that operated, how that organization worked, how that individual worked. And then you might look at those multiple case studies and compare them across different settings to try and get a bit more of an understanding. In terms of accessibility, they're easy to understand and they're really commonly used by funders. So whether or not that's Sport England, Big Lottery, and they often come in a very basic format. I'm just interested in knowing a little bit more about what you've done, how your project has operated and what you've achieved in terms of outcomes. But to be really effective and to be truly sort of rigorous, in inverted commas, you need multiple data sources. So you need to probably be using a combination of focus groups, interviews, written logs, observations, etc., so that you can really show that the conclusions that you are coming to are very reliable, and also to eliminate your own bias. And I'll come back onto the eliminate bias part a little bit later on. Now, in terms of general qualitative inquiry, this is the one that's probably the most suitable for the project manager who's just looking to find a way to add some value to their project. If you don't want to be constrained by a very particular approach, this is your starting point. And it's very effective in the sense that it doesn't necessarily have to fit into any of those other qualitative design boxes. How it works is that it can focus solely on one technique, or it can use multiple forms of data. So you might focus just on, say, interviews, or you might focus just on, say, focus groups. And it allows you a lot more flexibility in terms of your sample size and your data collection procedures. So you could go for a very small group, you could go for a larger group. It gives you that flexibility when you're working in an environment where actually your project's potentially still in its infancy and you're still looking to develop it. In terms of accessibility and how easy it is to sort of get started, it is easily accessible because it's generic in nature. And there's a real emphasis on describing and understanding an experience. So you could potentially be going in to evaluate, say, a project aimed at improving the mental health of middle-aged men. And you've made a focus on using sports and you're trying to sort of improve their mental health literacy as well. You could go into that setting, taking quite a general qualitative approach. You could maybe do focus groups to try to get a bit more understanding about how they felt the experience went, what they learned. It will become very descriptive and you can potentially paint a really good picture of what that project looks like. But because it's got a very generic nature and there's a lot of breadth to it, you've got to ensure that you're very explicit about your motivations and you've got a really clear strategy, again, to eliminate that bias, which we'll come on to a bit later. In terms of having a very clear strategy, that's just making sure that you can really clearly define why it is you're using this particular evaluation approach, what it is that you're hoping to achieve as a consequence of it, and how you're going to do that in terms of the steps that you're going to put in place. So that gives you a really brief overview of a couple of designs that you can go with. And in fact, the general qualitative inquiry is the one that I'm going to try to focus on for the next part of the session moving forward, because I think it is very accessible. And in fact, it's something that I've seen used very effectively and is often used very effectively without people necessarily realizing that that is the approach that they are adopting. And our emphasis here today is really on trying to make this is to simplify it and making it more accessible to people. You know, because often the process and the idea of evaluation can be quite off-putting, and actually it can look extremely time-consuming, and it can be, but actually in terms of the worth and the value of it, it's absolutely essential because it's what enables us to get more funding moving forward. It's what enables us to demonstrate the impact of our projects, and actually it's what enables us to continue doing the great work that we all do at a local or regional level. So in terms of those methods for collecting data, I'm going to give some examples now, which are worth considering. And the ones that I'm going to cover in particular are interviews, focus groups, observations, and written communications. And what I'll say here is that you've got to bear in mind that we could cover each of these in really significant depth. And my remit for today was really just to give you guys an introduction that you can go away and you can potentially start thinking about for your own work. And this will give you a sort of a basic introduction that you can use, and then you can hopefully go away and then think about how you might implement some of these approaches into your project design if you think that they sound suitable. So the first thing we've got to consider is that age-old argument, looking at those top two. Interviews versus focus groups. Why would I choose one over the other? So let's just break down what they both offer. Well, firstly, interviews. It might sound like teaching grandmother to suck eggs here, so I apologize if this is a lot of stuff that you know already, but in terms of breaking it down, it's always useful to have a bit of a refresher around this. So we know that interviews will often be in that one-to-one setting, and that you as the researcher are playing the role of investigator. You're looking to investigate how somebody feels about something or investigate what someone's experience was like. You ask the questions and you control the dynamic of that relationship in that setting. And it's a very effective setting for probing for experience so that you can find out a bit more and get a little bit more detail. It gives you that depth as well because you'll often have more time. You'll often last a lot longer. And you, as the investigator, are absolutely central to that discussion. So you will often drive it forward in terms of asking open questions or asking, sort of probing or bringing the session to an end when you feel like the conversation has given you as much data as you want. Now, in terms of the focus group, there is a different dynamic there because obviously for a start, it's a group setting. And you, as the researcher, will actually play the role of the moderator or the facilitator. So you ask the questions, but then actually you allow the discussion between the participants to drive the session forward, to drive that dynamic forward from that point onwards. So it's really, really effective for generating ideas, which is often why you'll see it used in that sort of stereotypical format for, say, like marketing companies who are looking to potentially create a new marketing strategy, and they want to know whether or not you think this idea sounds really good, or they want to know whether or not you love this color on this new can of Coke or something like that. And you as the researcher then become peripheral to the discussion. You're still important because you're there potentially to act as somebody to keep peace or to be a gatekeeper for discussion. But in terms of the role when compared to the interviews, your role is a lot more removed. So why would you choose one approach over the other? Well, firstly, why would you use interviews? Well, like I said, they allow you that one-to-one, in-depth opportunity to develop insight. And actually, it can create a lot less bias in the sense that people may be more comfortable talking privately than in a group. So actually, in terms of creating a bit of bias on the conversation in terms of other participants, they won't have a massive influence on what somebody might say. It can be a little bit more interrogatory, which is something to manage, and that will come down to your own sort of technique. But it will allow you to be very specific about certain experiences or opinions, and it gives you the opportunity to really probe around a particular topic. And if you've got the right kind of questions set up, and the right kind of sort of probing questions that you've looked at and you've considered, it can really allow you to go into a great deal of depth. And it's excellent in terms of developing further rapport, because what this will allow you to do is in that one-to-one environment, really make it seem like the only experience that you're interested in is the person who's sitting opposite you. So in terms of a sort of a flow of what we're thinking about, if you're comfortable in a one-to-one environment and your participants are comfortable in a one-to-one environment, if you've got plenty of time to have those discussions and then also to transcribe, because in terms of an in-depth interview, if you really get going with somebody, it could go on for, for an hour, 2 hours, even longer if they're really, really keen on talking about the topic. So you've got to be able to have that time to not only have that interview, but also transcribe it afterwards. If you've got the budget, because the other key thing about this is that time is money, so actually if your budget will allow you the time, the space and the opportunity to do that, then it's a good opportunity. It's a good example for use. And if you really want to understand about the behaviors or decision drivers or longitudinal behaviors that make somebody particularly choose certain options, then you could choose interviews as an effective option for your project. Now, in terms of focus groups, much like interviews, they draw upon the beliefs, the feelings, the experiences, etc., and the reactions in a group setting. So how they're often contrasted off against each other. And it allows for a real diversity but not only interviewees, but in terms of the topic as well, because it could go off into different directions. And, you know, as somebody thinks that something's relevant, they bring it into the group, and somebody doesn't think that's relevant, so they sort of create a little bit of a dynamic where they're talking against each other, and that can open up further discussion. And actually, this will sometimes occur when you flip it on its head. Sometimes people aren't particularly comfortable about talking about things in a group setting, and they'd rather be one-to-one. But sometimes the opposite's true. Sometimes, actually, if somebody says something, they get encouraged by the fact that somebody agrees with them, and they'll say, oh, well, actually, you know what, I agree with that. And another thing is, and that can really create a good dynamic in a room and can give you some really rich data. And in fact, that social gathering element and that interaction can allow for sort of interactions that you might think to yourself, well, if I'd done this one-to-one, would I have got this same level of detail? Would I have got the same level of depth? What I would say, however, is that when you're working with a focus group, time and how you perceive time becomes very different. So you could work with somebody for 2 hours and get a great level of depth. But if a focus group lasts for 2 hours, actually, when you split that up around the group, the number of minutes that somebody might actually be sharing information or going into a particular topic will be reduced, obviously. So you have to bear that in mind when you consider the level of depth that you're looking for from your participants. So again, thinking about this and thinking about some flow. If you yourself are comfortable moderating groups, and that is a really big thing, because you've got to be comfortable being able to be in that setting and have the skills to be able to get the people who aren't talking involved in discussion, to be able to actually calm down and facilitate topics when they become a little bit heated. You've got to have that skill set, and that can be tricky, but there are ways of developing that. And actually, a lot of it comes down to practice in the setting. Are you shorter on time and you want to pull a group together? You know, that will certainly, you know, allow focus groups to become a viable option. Is your budget lower? Because again, those specific one-to-one interviews, each one could take a certain amount of length of time. So again, if you're looking to get a group together, you're trying to reduce that overall cost, you could get them into one room and make it a lot easier for you. In the same way as interviews, if you're looking to understand behavior and those decision drivers or longitudinal behaviors, absolutely ideal, then you should consider focus groups, and they will provide you with a great deal of value as a consequence of that. So in terms of our sort of open-ended interview style, those are the two that we can consider as methods. What about the others that we mentioned? So for a start, observation. So observation's a really unique one, and it's something that you both have to be quite careful with, but also that can be extremely valuable in getting rich data that you might not have considered in an interview. Because what you might do is you might visit a session or a project, and you'll aim to be quite removed, to be as unobtrusive as possible and remain quite detached from the group. And your focus is actually on watching rather than taking part. So technology is really valuable in terms of being able to videotape things or using things to write notes with, whether or not that's just a pen and paper or whether or not you're doing it on your phone or whatever. And actually videotaping with the appropriate consent, you know, and that can affect whether or not you have the ability to remain unobtrusive from the group, because often you have to gather that consent from people. Videotaping can be really valuable. And in fact, there are some great qualitative techniques. For example, something that's known as stimulated recall, which is where you videotape a session and then you use interviews to get people to come back in, watch the videotape, and you get them to stop it when they see something in that session that they think is meaningful to them, and then you might discuss it. So that can be a really effective method of creating a sort of a new format for discussion. And again, the aim in this particular situation is to try to, once you're content that you've got and you've seen all that you need to see, you would take that away, you take that recording away, or you take those notes away, and you then sort of write that up and consider what you've seen and create a bit of a report from that. Now, in terms of our flow and in terms of the context around this, firstly, have you got the appropriate consent? You know, because particularly if you're working with children, you're going to absolutely 100% need to get the consent from the supervising adults to actually film that session. Are you able to visit the session and remain detached and actually remain in such a fashion that you are not very clearly involved in the session and that you're unobtrusive? Have you got access to the technology or the budget to be able to do this, which is often a really big thing that prevents people from doing observation? Are you keen on understanding behavior contextually? This is a really big thing, because what observation allows you to do is really focusing on the context of the scenario. So you've got some young offenders, say, who are involved in a youth intervention project aimed at trying to reduce antisocial behavior. You want to watch them go along to their boxing session, or you want to watch them go along to their five-a-side football session or whatever, just to see what their interactions are like and what they're getting from that setting. So you can really specifically hone in on that context with observation. So if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for, definitely consider it as a method. So finally, what we've got written communication. And this is actually one of my personal favorites, because I think in terms of written communication, this allows people to have a very personal touch on their interaction with a project manager or a researcher. Because often when you give somebody a diary or you give them a journal, if they're really engaged in the process, they will really take care of that. They'll get committed. They'll want to write things, very personal to them, very interesting to them. And actually, often what will happen is that they'll give you that journal so that you can do your write-ups and whatnot. But then actually, they'll want to have it back at some point, because it's become something that's very personal to them. Interviews and focus groups, as I've said before, they can often feel like a bit of an interrogation. Excuse me. An observation can seem quite awkward, and you can't always be you come across quite obtrusive, and you can't always get the right consent, etc. Whereas a diary or a journal or a log gives people a lot of control, so that they can share what they want, when they want to, and wherever they want to. And in fact, giving someone a journal and asking them to fill it in regularly allows them to then fill it in a way that seems relevant to them. It's less about you saying, you've got to do this here, here, and here. Actually, if you say to them as a broad brush, oh, well, can you fill this in after your project, after we've completed the session, fill it in when you think is appropriate to you and when you feel like something comes up that you want to talk about, it gives them a lot of control. And actually, if they don't really want to do written stuff, they can do voice diaries, or they can do vlogs, whatever feels comfortable to them. They can do it in like a blog format. There's lots of different ways that you can do it now. The only key thing about this is it does require a certain amount of commitment. And sometimes the idea of filling in a journal or a blog or a diary every day, for example, becomes quite onerous. So you might change it so that you ask them to do it once a week, or you might change it so that they do it just once after the session each week or something like that. But if you do get them motivated, you do get them involved, they become an incredibly rich source of data that can be so valuable for your project moving forward, and actually can be really, really effective with children, because actually giving them that own personal little thing that they can have, that they can call their own, is often much, much better than you coming into that environment as a stranger and sort of feeling like you're interrogating them around a topic. So again, thinking about our flow, have you got participants who are willing to complete? Because there's got to be that sort of give and take. Actually, they've got to be willing to want to do it in the first place. You've then got to be able to clearly specify what you're looking for in terms of completing that journal or that log. So I'd really like you to do it once a week, or really want you to do it like once after every session or whatever, so that they get that understanding. You've also got to be, if you're in a scenario where we're operating on a lower budget, this is absolutely fantastic, because you can go out and you can buy like little textbooks or something like that from Smith's or from Waterstones or wherever, and it's pretty affordable. And in terms of actually, if you're willing to accept that your participants might not complete it every single time, but you're still happy to try to invest in this because you think the data will be rich, then I think this is something that you can really consider. And I think it's something that adds a lot of value into a project. And often it can be used in a valuable fashion alongside the other approaches. So if you're looking at doing an observation, but you'd like something a little bit more in depth as well, you can always think about a diary or a log or a journal as a way of getting that extra information. So I'm just going to revisit the topic of eliminating bias now, because I mentioned it earlier on, and some of you might have been curious about what I mentioned around that. The thing is that when you're so close to a topic, and You're so close to a project that you've designed from the very start. You've written the project initiation document. You're so invested in the Gantt chart that you see it in your sleep. Sometimes it can become almost impossible to actually separate yourself from it, and you know exactly what those outcomes are and what you want those outcomes to be. So you really go looking for them in the way that you go about your interviewing or you go about your collection of data. So some basic ways to eliminate bias. I've put some down here. Firstly, use multiple people to interpret the data that you collect. This is a really important one. So when I worked on some projects with HSP before, we had two or three of us who were involved in a project. What we did when we collected the qualitative data was that all three of us looked at it. All three of us sort of came up with some themes, and actually we were then able to look at those different themes as a group, and we were able to sort of work on them together to try and contrast them to see which ones we felt were most suitable, which ones we felt were way off key, and which ones we felt would give us the right kind of information that could then be used to show to funders or show to stakeholders. Ask your participants to review their results. This is a really key one, because actually, if you collect data from an interview and then you go back into that environment and you say, here's what I've typed up, do you think this is accurate? And they say no, then you're in a bit of a pickle. So you need them to be able to sort of review it so that they are happy with it, so that then you have got that 100% accuracy and you know that that's definitely what they were trying to get across. Gathering other data sources to support your findings. This is known as triangulation in qualitative research, and often will be where you focus on, surprise, surprise, 3 different types of data. So you might collect, say, interviews, you might do observations, and you might do written notes or something like that, all in 3 different settings, so that you can really effectively corroborate your information and you know that what you're getting is 100% reliable. Ask your peers to review your conclusions. This goes back to the interpretation of data as well. Again, when I was working on a project for HSP, we came together with some themes for something. Went to the other evaluation, to the other member in our evaluation team, and she had a look at it to have a look at it so that she could review it. And there were a few things that she didn't necessarily think were coming out of the data, some that she thought were, some that weren't. So we had that conversation, and that allowed us to sort of think about it in a lot more detail, and allowed me to actually understand, well, actually, am I having an effect on this data with the way that I'm interpreting it? Am I looking for certain themes as a consequence? And then the other thing is to really check for alternative explanations for why you collected that information in the first place. So you might think to yourself, well, I've collected this because I'm looking at a particular outcome. But actually, could there be more to it? Could it be that you've looked to collect data because you've been asked to try and tailor an outcome to something very specifically, or has somebody else got involved and you've thought that's a good idea, so you've started targeting that very specifically. So really think about all of those explanations as to why you might have collected the information in the first place. None of this will be important though if we don't think about our clients and we don't think about our audience. And this is the most important part for me of this session today, considering vulnerability and sensitivity. And I was inspired to write this particular presentation and to present on this particular topic today by an old friend who I used to work with, particularly who was working within a women's refuge. And every time we used to talk about qualitative information, she always used to say to me, but what sensitivity should I be considering? How should I be considering tailoring this to the particular group that I will work with? And I always said to her, I'll come back and I'll revisit this at some point. So hopefully this will be the opportunity today to get those answers. So what should we be considering? Well, firstly, due to the nature of the client base that we might work with, if we're working with people who we know have got potentially debilitating mental health conditions, we can sometimes focus on aspects of their life that can be considered very sensitive. And actually, there are certain topics that might come up in an interview setting that will elicit a lot more distress than others. And that can create a certain level of risk that we really need to be thinking about how we mitigate for that. The emotional responses that you get from that could be varied. It could be sadness, it could be anger, it could be anxiety, it could be fear. And actually what we need to do in terms of sort of the safeguarding side of things as well is we need to consider the most reasonable and appropriate safety measures to reduce the risks that are associated with A, breaches of confidentiality, and 2, invasion of privacy. So the first concept to think about is sensitivity. Now, sensitivity for projects is often quite tricky to be able to sort of put your finger on, but the majority of the time it's often associated with taboo topics. So the way that Lee describes this is he describes topics laden with emotion or which inspire feelings of awe or dread. And some really, what we might think that they're really obvious, but a variety of the topics that could come up, particularly if you're working in those very sensitive settings. It could be things like post-traumatic stress disorder, it could be drug use, birth or death, grief, rape. You know, these are topics that are laden, as Lee says, with emotion. And actually, when somebody revisits them in a session, they can be quite traumatic. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm running a sport project, you know, so this might not come up. Well, you might not think that, but how do you know for sure? Because we can't predict how our participants are going to be affected, because the issues that they have aren't always apparent from the outset. We don't know what their experiences are. That's why we're there in the first place, to find out about their experiences so that we can demonstrate how our project has had impact. And sensitivity comes hand in hand with vulnerability. Now, we've got to consider what's known as invisible vulnerabilities. So the Council for International Organizations of Medical Science describes that as such. So those who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests, they may have relative or absolute impairments in decisional capacity, education, resources, strength, or other attributes to protect their own interests. The way to think about this is, if a feature of a person's living conditions make it less likely that others will be sensitive to their interests, a person can also be considered vulnerable. And that could be somebody who is stigmatized or who faces social exclusion or is prejudiced. And actually, the variety of groups that fall into this category are quite varied. And we're quite fortunate because researchers have helped us to try to define these categories in a lot more detail. And a lot of them will be ones that you might see cross-cutting across things like safeguarding and stuff like that. So you've got individuals with a life-threatening illness or condition, children, ethnic or racial minorities, people who aren't fluent in the language that a project is being conducted in, the educationally or economically disadvantaged, people who've got a debilitating mental health condition or cognitive impairment, institutionalized persons, whether or not they're in a care home or a prison, and pregnant women. And actually, these groups are really effectively explained by Delaunay as those vulnerabilities that we absolutely must consider when we're approaching a project that looks at sensitive topics. So what can we do? Well, in this kind of environment, you know, particularly if it's not necessarily a research environment and you're not partnered with, say, a university, if there's no ethics panel involved, you know, how does a project manager adapt to that? You know, how do we make suitable considerations going into that setting? Well, the first thing is that there's got to be careful planning involved. There's got to be a consideration of an appropriate method. There's got to be understandings of the complexities of the group that you're working with. And we also need to apply some kind of sensitivity to the needs of the participant throughout. And we're very lucky because Dempsey created a framework that allows us to think about this and actually how this can be used within our qualitative interviewing or focus groups or observations. And it falls into each one of these different categories. And actually their paper is a paper that I've referenced at the end, so that if you guys want to find out a bit more about that, you can go on and you can have a look at each one in more detail. But I've tried to break down each one here just to give you a bit more understanding. So you've firstly got planning and preparation. So the things you've got to consider are that you've got to select your appropriate tools and then how you're going to collect the data. You've got to think about developing your interview schedule or focus group schedule, and you've got to have a really clear knowledge of it. And actually, you've got to then use that in a flexible way so that you can have meaningful discussion with your participants. So your actions will be liaising with the research team or the project team to make joint decisions, develop a suitable interview guide with set questions that you know inside and out, and conduct some kind of pilot so that this will allow you to get the practice that you need in the setting, and also will give you that experience of working with that group and also allow you to see whether or not your plan is even going to work moving forward. You then got to consider how you're actually going to access those groups. So who are your gatekeepers for accessing those groups is one thing. You've got to make sure that your participants have got plenty of information prior to taking part. How are they going to contact you? You know, have they got a reasonable method of being able to do so? And your actions are going to be meeting those gatekeepers in person, establishing a good relationship with them. It could be a local club, or it could be, say, a local mental health service or something like that. Explain very explicitly why that evaluation is needed and what value it brings. Provide the detail that's necessary to the participants in a way that they can understand, and make sure that it's very clear what the ask is of them. Time and locations is very straightforward. You've got to have flexibility on the part of the researcher. So arrange your interviews and focus groups at a time and location that's suitable for the participant. Really cater it to what they're able to achieve within the time frame that they've got. Building rapport is also essential. So you've got to think about how you're going to deal with emotion and distress. You've got to think about how you're going to care not only for yourself, but also for the participants. And it's got to create an environment where there's mutual trust, because we know that positive relationships in a setting like that is what's going to create the best discussion, that's going to give you the best data for your project. So effective listening is a must. And I'd always say to people to consider empathetic listening techniques or reflective listening techniques. If you're trained in anything like motivational interviewing or behavior change, that will be extremely effective for this. And identify a support structure around you within the setting so that you can deal with distress. So whether or not that's having people nearby or having a distress protocol that you've written up. Dempsey actually has an example distress protocol in the paper that I've mentioned, so I definitely recommend having a look at that. You've got to be able to think about, when you're interviewing and facilitating, being relatively therapeutic. So you've got to know your questions in advance so that they can freely flow off the page, so that it doesn't look like you're just sort of reading from your log the whole time. You've got to have those empathetic skills and be really comfortable with silence to allow people to think and let things register. And you've got to think about how you're going to make that environment comfortable. So your actions around that would be, know your questions so well that you could say them blind with a piece of paper about 4 miles away. Develop that distress protocol so that you've got that to hand and that you understand exactly what will happen if something quite emotive comes up. And source a space that's private, that's quiet, and that's not going to be they have any interruptions for your focus group or your interviews in particular, so that will put people at ease, and so that they know that they're in a setting where they can talk privately and it is safe for them. In terms of concluding it, we're on to the last couple now. Concluding your interviews, you've got to make sure that they end, or your focus groups, that they end in a positive way. Got to have some kind of positive closure. And actually, you've got to think about how your own values and beliefs and perceptions, that bias we've spoken about, can affect your data collection. And that's known as a concept called reflexivity in qualitative evaluation. Your actions for that, make sure you debrief with your participants. If appropriate, have some kind of support service details, much like Alicia did right at the very start, here to hand so that you can pass those on. Meet with the project or research team in advance so that you can discuss the process. And make sure that you're challenging your own bias by having a critical friend and a colleague, or making sure that you keep some kind of diary or log of what you've done and what you've said, so that you can see exactly where your bias might be relevant. Ethical considerations now to finish. Trust, informed consent from your participants, anonymity, and making sure that everything is confidential. That is absolutely key for the data collection, particularly within that sensitive environment. Have a risk assessment. Know it inside out. Have it alongside your distress protocol. And actually, some researchers talk about adhering very specifically to a code of ethics. And you can find example code of ethics online that can be perfect for being able to present you with a framework and a structure that you can use within that setting. So some resources and references that you might want to use if you're thinking about taking this approach forward. I've included there Corbin and Morse, because Corbin and Morse actually give some examples of excellent code of ethics that you can use, and they talk very specifically about sensitive topics. Lawrence Palinkis' paper about mental health services research gives a really great example of how qualitative methodology has been used in that setting. Dempsey is absolutely crucial if you're looking to try to do some sensitive interviewing, and I'd say that her paper is always one to immediately go for. And Sem and Waterfield have got a really great paper about the ethical challenges involved in focus groups and some of the things that you might want to consider in terms of if you're looking to try to use that method. Some recommended qualitative texts for you if you're looking for something very general. I'd look at Michael Patton's book, Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods, which has been updated many times over the years. And also the Qualitative Report, which is an online website which provides a lot of qualitative resources. And it also provides a newsletter which goes out and is a part of the journal that you can access some of the latest papers on the topic as well. So we're right very short at the end of time. So thanks so much for you guys for listening so intently to the session. I really appreciate it. I know we've thrown a lot at you within the last 55 minutes or so. I know we don't have a huge amount of time for questions, but if anybody's got some, perhaps we can have a look at some of them and we can think about them.
Thank you, Matt. That's been really good. Thank you. So we have two questions. So the first question is from Lee. Lee says, thanks for the session, Matt. Really helpful. Given the current situation, are there any extra considerations for running interviews, focus groups virtually?
That's a really great question. In terms of focus groups can often be broken down into a variety of different types in terms of how they work. You can find some really interesting information online. What I'll do is I'll send that to Alicia so that she can potentially share it after the session, because online focus groups is a very specific type of focus group. In terms of that kind of setting, the really key thing you need to think about is how you're actually going to work on interactivity. A really big thing around that at the moment, particularly not only for focus groups, but also for online training, is whether or not the video conferencing software that you use can provide you with the right kind of tools to promote that. I think the other thing that you'll often find in online settings is that sometimes people can be a little bit more reserved. They might not be willing to step up and say something. So a big part of that comes down to the moderator and actually how you have some kind of icebreaker or some kind of activity at the start to try to actually get people a little bit more comfortable in that environment. I generally say that as something that's an absolute norm for focus groups anyway. But in terms of this kind of approach, I'd say it's absolutely crucial for online.
Brilliant, thank you. So another one from Shanara. Shanara says, thank you, Matt. The ideas on challenging bias have been really useful too. Do you have any particular recommendations, strategies to evaluate the overall impact of well-being activities across large organizations? Part of the challenge my team have is gathering feedback and evaluating the impact of activities across different departments, as we do not host the majority of activities ourselves, but mainly try to help facilitate them.
I think that's a really great question. And I think one of the key things around that, when you're trying to deal with such a large sort of potential participant base, is in terms of what you'll get from quantitative research around things like questionnaires and stuff like that. What that will allow you to do is have a certain level of breadth in terms of being able to reach people. Surveys are relatively easy to complete and they can sort of be dealt with on it, in about 5 minutes potentially. So in terms of approaching it from that perspective, if you're looking to do sort of really approach a massive number, I'd always say that you use some kind of quantitative evaluation to be able to do that effectively. I would try to narrow it down very specifically, in terms of topics. So to give you an example, one of the projects I work on with Public Health England at the moment is called the Moving Healthcare Professionals Programme, which is a Sport England funded programme about trying to get healthcare professionals to more actively talk about physical activity within their clinical settings. The qualitative evaluation that we're doing on that at the moment is that we're working with Ipsos Mori. And the way that we're doing that is that we're doing a survey-based evaluation, looking at sort of from baseline so that we get a bit of an understanding about how their knowledge and skills change as they do the training that we run. Then in terms of qualitative, what we're doing is we're reaching out to very specific participants who've taken part. And we're saying to them, would you be interested in being involved in some one-to-one interviews? We're then doing sort of one-to-one interviews with people who are involved in the actual management of the process, to try to understand a bit more about the challenges and barriers that they face trying to get that to work in an environment, within such a large scale environment. And then what we're doing is we're running some very specific focus groups. Again, if we're trying to pull together a group of participants. One of the key things I'd say about qualitative research is that in terms of generalizing across populations, it's very difficult to do that with a small number of people, because obviously you can't necessarily say that they are speaking for an entire population. So I'd make sure that if you do try to do some focus groups where you're looking at something very exact within a large scale organization, that you try to make sure that the group that you're dealing with are very similar in terms of potentially where they sit in terms of grade, what their accessibility might be in terms of how they're actually accessing what you're trying to do and what you're trying to do with your project, so that you can make sure that it becomes a lot more generalizable across that one population. It will be difficult across large scale, but that is something that I try to recommend. Try to narrow it down from there, and then try to use the quantitative elements to get a much broader understanding in terms of larger numbers. Hopefully that's answered a little bit of your question.
Thank you, Matt. And we've got time for one more question. That's from Christine. Any feedback supporting the storytelling approach based around the most significant change?
In terms of the storytelling approach and stuff like that, absolutely amazing with children in particular. And in fact, I'd probably say that some of the projects that I've worked on previously, I've also used it with adults with learning disabilities as well, because it's a really, really effective method or a really effective methodological approach as a means of actually trying to get rich data. The key thing that I would say is that you've got to be quite so firstly, the narrative approach of storytelling and the narrative and how actually storytelling works is so great for kids, because I don't know what audience it is that you're particularly working with, so I'm really sorry if I go off on a tangent that's not relevant. But in terms of sort of the narrative approach for storytelling in kids, that's really fantastic, because that presents them with the opportunity to create some kind of life history narrative that seems really relevant to them and really taps into their creativity, particularly at a young age. I often find that with, say, interviews with kids and stuff like that, sometimes they really struggle to engage, because, as I've mentioned before, you're like one stranger who's coming into a setting that feels a bit random and strange to them. And actually, in terms of focus groups as well, when you've got a small group of kids, sometimes they can actually be really exciting and you can get a lot out of that. But what the storytelling side of things will allow you to do, particularly if you're using sort of written communication as well, what that allows kids to do is work within something that doesn't have any structure. So they can be very broad in how they go about things. It's something that we use quite effectively on one of the projects that we ran at HSP, in terms of, it was a Sport for Social Change project actually, but it was working very specifically with kids. And it was used to try to encourage them to sort of tell stories about how they found the project and how they found the setting and how what was most relatable to them based on those stories. I think that you have to be very understanding about the fact that when you use that approach, because the narrative approach in particular around that can be so broad, you could get a huge amount of data to start with, to work with, which is fine if you've got time to be able to analyze through that. But if you haven't, it can be quite restrictive. And also just bear in mind that it could go off on a variety of different areas, of different tangents, particularly if you're working with kids. One thing I would say in terms of mental health is that it can be a really effective method as well to try to get people to relate certainly around depression and damaging things like grief. That storytelling approach can really get people can be really helpful to get people to break down the different stages that they've been through across their life history and where they feel those certain things came into place at certain times. So I would definitely say it's a valuable method and is always something to consider if you're trying to work with an audience that would be receptive of it. Sorry, I've run over time.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you everyone for tuning in. That would be the end of this session. Another session 2:30 Hope Virgo. So please drop me an email if you haven't had a chance to register but would like to participate. So we'll finish there. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you soon.
Guys, sorry, Alicia. Before you go, I've just put my email in the chat. If anyone's got any other questions or they want to know a little bit more or anything like that, or they want to have just a chat in general about certain stuff to do with mental health and qualitative projects or whatever, just drop me an email.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you guys soon.